This is an introduction to Renaissance. Includes the Italian Renaissance and the Renaissance in the North, that is, in Northern Europe. There will be a big contrast between the two. And I want to start first with the Italians. Around 1400, properly, is when the Renaissance began. Though the century before we call the Proto-Renaissance, and I want to show how we got to the Renaissance from that point, from that century. And first, I'm looking at Masaccio's Madonna and Child enthroned. You see a woman holding a baby on a throne. The woman looks realistic, or naturalistic. You can tell that it's an object in space. Light is shining on it with light and tone modeling. There's images of the angels in the front. If you can see my cursor, the angels in the front, creating a spatial relationship between themselves and the throne behind, and then there's angels behind. So this looks like a real person in real space, and the baby actually looks, like a baby, like the artist looked at a baby and saw how they were proportioned and how they behave, and this is what we think of as a sort of a revolution in the way things were depicted, because before this they were very different. And I want to show you how you got to this through the Proto-Renaissance and before then. A century before this was painted, Giotto made this Madonna and Child, and it's a direct antecedent to it. And it's a traditional image of having the Madonna sitting on a throne with saints around, and when holding the baby Jesus, there's halos. The throne is also a three-dimensional object in space, but you do see it's different than the one we saw before. This one is much more convincing, as with our perception of the way photographs look and how objects look in space. This is a lot different. So how did we get from here to there? Well, let's look before. This is the teacher of Giotto. It's Cimabue. And he also has a Madonna and Child enthroned. A woman, Mary, holding the baby Jesus in her lap. There's angels on either side, and there's saints down at the bottom, and there's a throne. It's kind of three-dimensional looking. The figure doesn't look quite as three-dimensional and convincing as a spatial thing as the Giotto. But the throne, I guess, is where you see a little bit more of the three-dimensional aspect. But just a century prior to that, we had this. And this is a very big change. This is what we think of as typical of the Middle Ages. This is a Madonna and Child enthroned, and there's angels, and the throne is a kind of a three-dimensional-ish looking object. But the concept of it is altogether different. In the Middle Ages, the art had come from the Roman Empire. The Roman Empire had a certain kind of art, and then when it fell, just before it fell, I guess, in 300, in the 300s, Constantine allowed Christianity to be the main religion of the empire, and as a result, Christianity coming to the fore became, an established thing, and the artist at the time made art like the Romans had made art. And what we think of as Roman, this kind of thing, what do you think is typical as a Roman kind of representation? It's naturalistic and it's idealistic. By naturalistic, I mean it looks like a real person. The proportions, the details, all of the bones, the artist has understood bones and musculature and how a person stands with the weight and the tilt of the head. The different features are all naturalism. It looks like what we see in the real world, except that they've gone farther and chosen the best representation. That is, if you look at a lot of different people, some people are proportioned one way or another, and you see Some have a better shaped head than another, or their hands are better, or one other has the height is right, but something else is wrong with them. I mean, when you look at a whole bunch of people, you'll find different qualities among them. And the ideal qualities would be you take the best of this and the best of that, and you mix them together, and you make a figure that you think of as the idealized figure. So it's not natural because nobody actually is the ideal, but you can infer an ideal from lots of different people. That's what the Romans did, and they got this idea from the Greeks before them because they liked Greek art, and they made their art very similar to it as far as depicting the human figure. But later on in the Roman Empire, this is just before the Christian era, there was a big change where, when it was falling, and these are the tetrarchs, by the way, when the Roman Empire was falling, and they had to divide it up, and there was an attempt to keep it going. And they had 4 emperors at one time, and this is a depiction of all 4 emperors, and they had this radical change in the way they depicted the human figure. This isn't naturalistic. The figures look kind of doll-like. The emphasis is on the patterns of the surface patterns. You don't notice any kind of real skeleton underneath. The proportions are kind of weird. It's not about the structure of the figures. They're like dolls, and they weird proportions. They're almost like cartoon versions of people. But this was a style that they adopted, and it became the official style. Notice how the emphasis is on patterns. The patterns you see in these little skirts and all the armor and the cloth. Notice that this cloth that falls over the shoulder, for example, it doesn't fall the way real cloth would. It looks like the lines are a reference to the way cloth does, but they're not actual. I mean, when you look at the Prima Porta Augustus, this is actual cloth observed from the real world. So this is the type of art that was in existence just as the time that the Christian era began, or at least after Constantine made Christianity official. So at the beginning of the Middle Ages, after the Roman Empire fell, they started out with a style that was not naturalistic. They also, because their art was Christian and not pagan, that they had different stories to tell, and they told them different than the way the Romans or the Greeks had told stories and represented figures, because they were representing spiritual things. They weren't intending to represent figures or making you think of these figures as real people in real space. They were in a kind of a spiritual fantasy world. They were at an upper, higher level, so that being realistic would have made them look, normal and less special. So they developed a style that ultimately goes back to the Roman style. I mean, this kind of drapery, it really is, it's kind of a toga, the way the Romans would wear, and the way it falls over, it harkens back, in a sense, to the Romans and how they used to depict things, but really, it's about the surface pattern. And any line that you see that might coincidentally mean something in the real world is actually just there for its pattern effect. I mean, it's gold, and it's pretty, and it's designed to evoke a spiritual reaction. You look at it and you contemplate Mary and Jesus, and notice Jesus, the proportions of the baby. It looks like a miniature man, and he's like a doll, and Mary is kind of like a doll, kind of almost like a paper doll. It's flat. This is the style you think of as being like playing cards that we have now, the king and queen and jack of a playing cards. Those are medieval. The throne, the representation of an object in space, well, it's all what we think of as kind of wonky. I mean, it doesn't look right. This backside, the inner side, doesn't seem to conform to the same shape as the outside, and it doesn't look right because they weren't depicting a real object in space. They're depicting patterns on a surface. So, a century after this was made, and this is typical of practically the whole Middle Ages. I mean, all of these characteristics you see here go back hundreds and hundreds of years till the very end of the Roman Empire. But just before Giotto came around, this is the precursor to Giotto, his Cimabue, his teacher. There was a different movement around. Petrarch, for one, Boccaccio and Dante. These writers, they began a sort of a new movement. Petrarch especially. He was a scholar who looked at he liked to look at books. He'd go to monasteries, the libraries, and find books that were like really old stuff from what you think of as antiquity, the Romans and the Greeks, and he would see those books and notice that the Latin in those books was a lot better than the Latin that they were speaking. And that sort of began a trend of looking back at the Roman Empire and what they thought of as antiquity, and a desire to bring back that sort of mythical past of the greatness that used to be, that they knew, from the ruins that they had around them, that used to be, and it was wonderful. And it began with actually Latin bringing back, but other types, other aspects of the period, they wanted to bring back. The notion that individual people, are important rather than just, as a community, that the individual is important. And in the century just before Giotto, you have Francis of Assisi, and he preached having a more personal experience or relationship with God. And if you have a personal relationship with God and with Jesus and Mary, then they become more like you. That they're like real people, and you want to represent them more like real people. Now, in art, things don't change really, really fast, and you have this Cimabue. This is a very large picture. It's like, 12 feet tall, and it's gold, a big gold panel with egg tempera paint, and it has all sorts of traditional stuff. This the pattern of cloth that you see here, with it's blue, it is painted on top of gold, and then the blue is scratched off to reveal these patterns. Similar to the kind of thing that you see here. The paint is scratched off, gold is underneath it all, and the paint scratched off to reveal all these patterns. Well, Cimabue did that too, here. And this is a traditional face, everything. The tooling is what they call this, using patterns and punches and straight edge and needles and things to mark all this patterns in the gold ground in the background. That's all traditional. But there's just something more human about Mary now, and about the angels, and this throne that she's sitting on looks three-dimensional. It looks like an actual thing in actual space, the same space that you're occupying when you look at it. And this is just like, one little baby step in the direction is what's going to be the Renaissance. But you see a precursor, and then the early art historians, when they looked at this, they modeled this after, the Gospels, where you have John the Baptist signaling or prophesying the coming of the Messiah. And they think of, they would use Cimabue as an analog. Cimabue would be like John the Baptist, and then Giotto would be like the Messiah coming, because they thought of Giotto as beginning this new way of depicting things, about resurrecting what was antiquity. So here we have Giotto, and you see the throne, and the relationship of the figure to the throne is much more like a real person. The figure has mass. This figure of Mary, it's modeled in light and shade as if it were a real three-dimensional object. And the person, it looks like a very, very matronly but massive person compared to Cimabue. There's hardly any physical presence of a real person underneath. It's just like a paper doll, or just a bunch of drapery pattern over a face and hands and with a foot sticking out. There's hardly any real 3 dimensions of the figure at all. But when you get to Giotto, it's the big change. You have all the things that are going to be the characteristic of the Renaissance. That is, an interest in making people look like real people in real space. Take a note of the halos too. There's something odd about halos, since halos are actually derived from the idea of light emanating from a person's head, like from, as it says when Moses came down from the mountain in Mount Sinai, and he had seen God, and he had light rays coming from his head, and that notion that a holy person has light coming from them is the antecedent to halos. Well, when they first thought of people as these spiritual people, these paper doll kind of people, they would have halos that would be, geometric circles behind their head, and that represents the light glowing from them. And Jesus would have his own particular one with its cruciform halo. That's the symbol for, you can recognize Christ by that. Cimabue has the same sort of halo. When we get to Giotto, when you have real people in real space, you run into a problem. Because what does a halo do when a person is a real 3-dimensional object in space? And you can see there's some oddness here, where there's an angel here who must be looking back at Mary, and yet the halo is in a sort of a disc behind their head, so that they would actually be having to look through their halo. And also look at the people in the back, how they're arranged compared to Cimabue. They're stacked up so as to be to diminish their spatial aspect, to make them look more like a pattern of people, one on either side, and the ones behind are lifted up in such a way that you can see the ones in the behind just as well as the ones in front. Giotto sees them as real people in real space. Well, when you see a crowd of people, the people in front, you see them whole, and the people behind are occluded. They're obscured by the people in the front. And the same goes with the halos. The halos are covering up the people behind. So they become a conceptual problem for people when in this change. And it's only a problem for a while, as you see with Masaccio. He resolved the problem. A halo is a disc behind a person's head that can move with the person. And other examples from Masaccio will do this, and will move further in this direction. So you have a group of people, all of whom in their heads in different positions. The halo becomes a kind of a frisbee-like object attached to the back of your head. So no matter where your head is pointed, that halo moves with it. The trend towards naturalism and making real people in real space continues on. By the end of the century, the 1400s, you get this kind of thing, and this is Mary holding the baby Jesus with saints and angels, and it's absolutely real in every way, except to the extent that it is idealized, and so they've really brought back pretty much what we think of as the Roman style, or the Roman conception of the way figures should be represented. They didn't actually have any Roman two-dimensional art to look at, because most of that didn't exist anymore, or was buried in Pompeii, which they hadn't discovered yet. But they did have descriptions by Roman writers of what their art was, and one of the features of it was that it was so real it would fool your eye into thinking it was the real thing. And this was the way they would compliment in the Renaissance one another about how good they were able to represent people and things in space, that it looked so good that it looked real, or that they have surpassed and embittered the artists, the ancients. And that was the best you could aspire to, is to surpass them. So that's the Renaissance in Italy, and I want to on your list of works you have the Cimabue is the first one, and then the Giotto, and we'll be looking at other things as well. And the thing that I want you to be able to do is compare one thing to another and be able to say the similarities and the differences between any two that you look at, and what their relationship is. So the relationship is often going to be a historical one, of one's earlier, one's later, and they're part of a kind of a trend in one direction. I mean, from the Renaissance, everything earlier tends to be less naturalistic, and everything later tends to be more naturalistic. And artists move in that direction. They haven't. When someone has an innovation, well, the next artist who sees that has to incorporate that innovation and make their own art with it and innovate something themselves. So by the time you get to the end of the century, you can reproduce anything you wanted in a convincing reality.